Buenos días para todos y todas. Nos encontramos en este momento en el conversatorio Afrodescendientes y la COP16. Entonces ya nos encontramos en vivo, Absalón, Prestos y demás compañeros desde las redes del proceso de comunidades negras PCN.
Listo, Arwen.
Sí, Absalón, ya estamos en vivo.
Listo, bueno. Lindo día para todos, para todas quienes se conectan a través de estos canales para darle continuidad a nuestra conversación sobre el tema de secuencias digitales sobre los recursos genéticos en el marco de las negociaciones que se van a tener de cara a la COP16 que se va a realizar este año en Cali. Como indicamos, el proceso de comunidades negras y su red de aliados, estamos generando este tipo de conversaciones para fortalecer nuestras capacidades como movimiento social de cara a las conversaciones que tenemos en esta discusión. En el día de ayer estuvimos conversando fundamentalmente sobre los antecedentes de este tema relacionado con las secuencias digitales, donde fundamentalmente estuvimos mirando y se destacaron temas relacionados con los conocimientos ancestrales asociados a los recursos genéticos, la relación que existe sobre este tema con la Organización Mundial de Propiedad Intelectual, los intereses que tenemos los pueblos afrodescendientes en relación con la salvaguarda y la protección de los conocimientos y los recursos genéticos, pero también los intereses asociados a cómo es el tema de la distribución justa de beneficios. Esos fueron como algunos de los temas centrales que se tocaron en el día de ayer. Vamos a darle la palabra a nuestro experto Preston, que nos está ilustrando sobre este tema para que adentremos en los contenidos que vamos a profundizar en el día de hoy. Y recordarles que este primer ciclo son 3 sesiones, en el día de ayer, el día de hoy, y cerramos mañana con la última parte relacionada con el tema de secuencias digitales. Entonces, adelante, Presto, y una vez más, gracias por este apoyo.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to speak to you. It's quite an honor. These issues are, of course, in your hands, and the reason you need to participate is to make sure that your rights are reflected in the final decisions. And I'm happy to help. So yesterday, if you'll remember, just to recap very briefly, what we talked about was genetic resources, and I focused on those. Towards the end, though, I said genetic resources are different from digital sequence information, because digital sequence information, being information as defined by Western scientists, is not a physical thing, it's not tangible, it's not a genetic resource. We did have a decision that did say the use of the creation of digital sequence information from physical samples is a utilization of genetic resources, but it's actually not itself a genetic resource. Today, I'm going to have to go into a little bit into the technicalities. I am sorry for that, but it's good to try to know at least some of the basics in order of how genes work, in order to understand why once you go to the genetic level as opposed to the sample, that the world is different, and why it is difficult to both define and claim pure property rights over gene sequences. It's much easier to claim property rights over a sample because they come from your territories. But once you get to the gene level, there are many, many difficulties. And this is what this new mechanism is trying to resolve, because it's saying there are conditions where it becomes very difficult to sort out who owns what. So what they're proposing is, in those conditions, you have a global mechanism that provides funds to everybody. And again, the funds would be focused on indigenous peoples and local communities and Afro-descendants. The funds would be available to you. That's not to say everybody would get the funds, and the funds don't come as money given for any purpose whatsoever. It would be funding for projects that help you maintain and innovate with your traditional knowledge, and so on, help reinforce it, potentially even reinforce land rights, territorial rights, things like that, enforcement of other rights related to the conservation of biodiversity. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Go to the slide that says end of day one. So we've covered all this. Okay. So just again to recap, that most gene sequences are shared very widely within and between species. So it's not just on the species on your territory, other members of that species have the same genes outside of your territory. And also species quite unrelated have genes in common. There's also no control over the movement of species. That's natural. Seeds move, pollens moves, species fly, they swim. And when they swim or fly or disperse their seeds out of your territories, that's a natural process. So it's not strictly biopiracy. And I also, at the end of the day, mentioned that you have to remember that species also move into your territories from another sovereign's territory. So if we get in too much into that game of trying to, say this is mine, then you will have to come up with arguments of why things that move into your territories are not somebody else's property. So it's really the whole purpose of the mechanism is to try to sort out, once you get beyond the sample itself, you have to then deal with the gene level, and that's a very different world. And even with endemic species that we started to talk about yesterday, or endemic genes, even if the species is endemic, most of the genes within those species are not. They're, again, widely spread, but also some are. And of course, some of those contain novel, what are called mutations, novel differences that are unique to your territories that are valuable. And there are corporations and companies and researchers looking for those. But most of what they want to find actually can be found both on and off your legal territories. They're also historically, because these technologies of sequencing chromosomes and genetic material has been going on for 30 years or more. And so there are trillions of sequences already out there that were not regulated, and you cannot really go backwards in time and say, well, that was illegal, we want you to do something about it. So the whole purpose of the benefit sharing mechanism is to get funds to populate a global fund that then is used to support projects, and those projects will be mostly for indigenous peoples, local communities, including, or as another category, Afro-descendants. Next slide. So here's what we're talking about. And again, I'll try to keep the technical jargon to a minimum. So this is a picture of a chromosome. There's a few organisms that have just single chromosomes. But most have multiple chromosomes. So in humans, we have 23 of these things. One of these are just for determining sex. 22 of them determine all sorts of things about how you make a body, and they influence all sorts of things. Now, abstractly, you can think of this as a twisted ladder with rungs. So here's the physical thing, and here's a representation on the right of that physical thing that shows this twisted ladder with rungs, and that's essentially what a chromosome is. Next slide. So here's another representation. You have the chromosome, and then as you go to the right, you can see it being shown abstractly, more abstractly, and you see these rungs. Now, the first thing I want you to know, to pay attention to the colors of those little bars on the rungs. And in the next slide, I'll show you what those mean. Next slide. All of life is made up of really, there are 5 molecules, but let's just say 4. The 5th one occurs in some places, but not in others. But essentially, all life is made up of 4 different molecules, only 4. And the thing is, these molecules pair with each other. So there's 2, they are called bases. So actually think of it as all life being made of a pair of 2 bases. So that's actually two different kinds of rungs on the ladder, which is actually pretty amazing when you think about it. There's no variation in these rungs. An adenine molecule is always exactly the same as another adenine molecule, no matter where you find it. So variation in life is not caused by differences in these 4 molecules. They're always the same. But what all the variation is caused by is the sequence of these rungs on this ladder. So you have, trillions of these things within your cells, within the cells of all living beings. And the pattern of the sequences is what determines all the differences among species. But it also means that there's a lot of similarity because, again, there's only 2 different types of ladder rungs. Next slide. So you can represent each one of those molecules by a letter, by the letter beginning with its name. And this is what a digital sequence looks like. It doesn't really look it doesn't look interpretable, but it is. So this is when people talk about genetic sequence information, what they mean is the physical structure of the DNA gets translated. You know what the order of the molecules are, and then you just represent each molecule by its appropriate letter. And then that's the sequence. Now, again, as I said yesterday, the debate was, do these sequences of letters have anything to do with the Convention on Biological Diversity? And the decision was, it was a very sensitive political decision. Yes, it is under the Convention on Biological Diversity. All these little A's, C, T, G's, that's part of this convention, but there's still many parties that don't think it is, but they allowed the decision to go forward, and that's an important part. Okay, next slide. So we have, I don't want you to get too bogged down. I just want to show these couplets. These are nucleotides. There are invertebrates, like animals with backbones, mammals, birds, reptiles, things like that. There are 3 billion to 6 billion of these ladder rungs. There are 100 million to 3 billion invertebrates, like snails and so on. In plants, it's 100 million to 10 billion. Bacteria have much smaller genomes. It's 5 million to 10 million. So you can see that actually there's a very, very, very large number of both these rungs involved. And then these rungs small segments of rungs create genes. And so you can see there are 30,000 genes in vertebrates, 20 to 30, 10 to 50 in invertebrates, 10 to 50 in plants, a few hundred in very small bacteria, and so on. Okay, next slide. So now, I've said genes are shared very widely between species. If we look at human beings, which are not part of the convention, but is useful as an illustration, because every species has the same kind of relationship with other species, because all life is connected through genes. Human beings, 99.8% of their genes are shared exactly in common with chimpanzees. So say you were to claim property in your genes, as humans, what you would also be doing is saying, well, I also own 99.8% of chimpanzee genes. 80% of your genes are exactly like genes found in bears. 60% are exactly alike genes found in salmon. 40% are like genes found in insects. And 24%, 1/4 of your genes, are exactly like those found in wine grapes. So the point is, it becomes then very difficult to sort out of these billions of ladder rungs of who, who owns what, because the ladder rungs are shared so widely among very different species. Next slide. Next slide. So the situation is, here's a bunch of chromosomes. As I said, multiple chromosomes in most organisms, and that little arrow points to a little red dot. And you can barely see it. In actuality, that's just much amplified so you can see it. It's a really tiny part of the genome. So that actually could be what you own, that little small difference. But again, as I said, next slide. I guess I left out the slide from yesterday. Just remember, well, let's see. Let me read this. Yeah, so just remember yesterday, as I said, the CBD and Nagoya Protocol focus on what's called a territorial or geographic model, which says, yeah, you own samples on your territory, but as things move and disperse, then it becomes very difficult. So even novel genes, unique genes, are likely to move out of your territory, and that can happen very quickly. And again, other mutations, other novel genes may be moving onto your territory, and it then becomes difficult to demonstrate conclusively that the genes really originated from your territory. You can do it, and there are cases where that's important. But because of this movement in every single direction, you're likely to get many sovereignty disputes over who owns what. So next slide. And this is a picture of what the situation is. They're moving in and out of your territories. Now remember, the traditional knowledge associated with genetic material, with genes, that's always yours. And again, the convention has said multiple times, that's yours. So we can that doesn't mean they implement it. That doesn't mean they recognize it effectively. But the convention says it is. And remember, I said these treaties are soft law treaties. They're not self-implementing. You have to do the implementation in country. So if your country is not effectively recognizing the rights that the convention says, your rights to traditional knowledge, and in some cases, genetic resources, you have to fix that at the national level. But you have the tools, the language is there. It says you have a right to your traditional knowledge and sometimes to your genes. But again, it's on your territory and it only relates to the sample, not the actual ownership of the genes underlying it. Next slide. So what that means is we have many origins and many jurisdictions that we have to deal with. Don't worry about the labels so much. It just means that some of these things are shared because they have a very ancient origin. So that things like flies and gorillas and sunflowers all have common ancestors, have a common origin, at least in the Western worldview under evolutionary theory. You don't have to buy into that theory or believe it. The reality, though, the pattern that we see is that we see all this wide sharing of genes. But it also means that the same genes on your territory occur in national parks, they occur next to your territory, or other lands, farmers' lands, national lands, private lands. So all of those things, the genes are found there. And again, finding those unique genes that are endemic to your territory can be difficult and expensive, somewhat expensive. So as I also talked about yesterday, this is a challenge to the gene sovereignty regime because, first of all, most legal jurisdictions, in terms of your legal rights, limit most of your rights to your current territory. And other rights, for example, if you have moved or migrated for various reasons, or if states have confined you to a small area, then those ancestral areas are not under your legal control. And different states do recognize some rights in these ancestral areas, but very few. As I said yesterday, all I have found is an example from Queensland that recognizes that you still have rights in those ancestral domains. So whether they were stolen or ceded in a treaty or an agreement or otherwise occupied, these lands are, in most country jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, are not under your control. And again, there is no problem in extending that, but that is mostly a country level battle and struggle. Next slide. Another, oh, sorry, that was the slide I was talking from and I didn't notice it hadn't. So next slide, that's the slide I just referred to. Okay, another problem that a lot of people don't understand is that the Western system also has shifted from allowing ownership of naturally occurring genes to not allowing ownership of naturally occurring genes. It's not well worked out. It's a little weird because when states assert sovereignty over things, they say they own them, but what they're really referring to is they're owning genetic resources, which are any sample coming from their territory. But when you go to the gene level, you're no longer talking about samples. You now are talking about these genes that are often, mostly, widely shared. And most jurisdictions say you cannot own a naturally occurring gene. It's actually in the public domain. And if you get intellectual property rights, the kinds of things that companies and corporations and industry wants to create intellectual property so that they can make money. And again, this is the mechanism, depends on money being generated somewhere. That's through patents. And patents aren't granted for genes, naturally occurring genes. They're granted for what are called novel, non-obvious, and inventive steps. So in other words, you have to modify the gene so that it's not something natural. And then they also get patents on the processes for manipulating genes. So often they look at genes in order to better understand how to manipulate things, and they patent the process for manipulation. So it's not the genes themselves that are given the intellectual property, it's the modified versions. Next slide. So again, that's all I really want to go into the technical parts. But you need to understand those technical parts to understand why we've gone this route. So just again, to give a short recap, the digital sequences are not genetic resources. And so in order to bring it under the convention, they interpreted it as being a utilization of genetic resources. So they came up with we've come up with a model, and here's the IIFB model that we've developed. It's not entirely the model everybody has, but we've supported the hybrid approach, and we believe the decision of 15.9 supports this model. We said, first of all, under Nagoya, you because all genetic resources come from somewhere, then you should not be able to turn those into digital sequence information unless you get prior informed consent, or free prior and informed consent, or approval and involvement, the three terms that have been used. So we've been clear on that. Nothing should be deposited. None of these sequences of A, C, T, G that are just letters on a digital piece of information should be deposited in a database without prior informed consent, at least from indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendants. Then once it's deposited, it will no longer work by the Nagoya rules. We can't, as I said, there are trillions of these things out there. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of interactions every day of people interacting with these databases. And it would be impossible to kind of, for every one of those, there's not enough of Afro-descendants and others in the world to stand over each transaction and try to negotiate through mutually agreed terms, details. So the advantage of Nagoya, which didn't bring a lot of benefits, but one of the big advantages is in a contract, you can control uses, you can control all sorts of, you can control the benefits that you want. But once it gets deposited in these databases, you can't have that level of control. So what we have said, and this is in the parking lot, this hasn't been decided and is still something we have to do in our open-ended working group meeting and at the COP, is to get an adoption of principles of data governance or a process to define the principles of data governance. So we can live with a decision that said this mechanism will create a committee or a process that looks at the principles of data governance. I think that may be more likely of where it's going to go. We also are talking independently to businesses to see if we can get them to agree to some principles. And these principles will stand in for mutually agreed terms. They won't be detailed, but in some ways, if we can get good principles, we can act, and because this is not a purely legal regime, we can maybe get the companies and the researchers to agree to principles that are stronger than Nagoya. Because again, it'll be voluntary, and they can say, just like corporate social responsibility or environment, social, and governance, ESG issues, we can maybe get some principles from business that could then be circulated. They could sign on to it and commit to them. It's not perfect, but it is I think a good way forward. And again, what we want to make sure is that what people talked about yesterday, biosafety, biosecurity, we might be able to get some principles established that said when working on ancestral lands, we will have some process to consult with you about collection of materials. So that's up in the air, and we are working heavily on focusing on these principles of data governance. The next thing is raising funds. How do we get money into a global fund? And again, this is a global fund to deal with digital sequence information. Nagoya is still in place, but for digital sequence information, we're trying to raise funds. And the question is, do you raise the funds from researchers? Like when they access one of these databases, you could have a license that says you have to pay certain amounts of money every year. And if you do use these data, here are some restrictions in order to protect privacy, in order to protect against biosafety and biosecurity concerns. So you can build in some safeguards, basic safeguards into the principles. So that's a good thing about raising funds from researchers. It can be coupled also to the issue of principles, but we also think researchers can you know, many of them, when they work for a company, they have money. Even when they work for not-for-profit and they work for a university, they have grants. These grants can be very large. And we're talking about maybe saying having a $200 or $250 a year license fee. But if you collected $200 a year from, you know, tens of thousands, or maybe even 100,000 researchers, that's a lot of money. So we can get some money raised through that. Another proposal is that we have 1% on commercial sales. So that would mean corporations would say, well, that are using DSI, digital sequence information, would say, I sold this amount of products using digital sequence information, and here's one, for example, 1%. It may be even less than 1%. And then also we can have voluntary contributions. One of the debates that we're having now is if we raise from researchers and from these other means, would that be a form of what they call double taxation? And again, I said yesterday, we don't believe, or maybe I didn't, I was on another group, I think I said it there. We don't believe that the double taxation is an issue, because in almost every country, you may have multiple taxes. Like you pay money at the store, at their cash register. When you buy things, there may be a tax. Your state may have a tax. And then your nation may have an annual income tax. So there are multiple forms of taxation. We believe that, yes, there are types of taxation which are not fair. But in general, we do, as long as it's justifiable and limited, we don't think the double taxation is a problem. Okay, so again, just to recap, we have the Nagoya Protocol. We have requirements that we believe that have to be fulfilled before you can deposit in the databases. Once in the databases, there will be money raised from any use somehow, it's not decided, and that will be put into this other box, the Global Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism. What this will do is distribute these funds as projects. As I said, we had the debate over who should get the money from, and I'll cover this in a second. But issues when we develop this fund is, how are these funds going to be distributed? What are the criteria for projects? What kind of projects will be funded? What, you know, and how would it be allocated to the different regions? How would we ensure that all indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendants, that everybody would get access to these funds as fairly as possible? And that includes making sure that rural Afro-descendants could also get the funds, because rural Afro-descendants often are at a big disadvantage. And we also know of the elites, the ones who've gone to college, which is great, and so on. But we have some organizations that have lots of college or higher education, educated people who know how to write grants and how to play these systems. And we want to make sure that they don't get an unfair proportion of the funds. Everybody needs to have funds. So biodiversity is endangered everywhere. Traditional knowledge is under threat everywhere. So we've said, in order to deal with this, we need full and effective, and again, this is an older slide, I meant to say, and Afro-descendant, but we need to have your full and effective participation in the governance in some way. And we're arguing over that. And I'll cover this in a little more detail tomorrow, because that's where we're going in the future negotiations. So we need to make sure all this is fairly distributed. Now, there's another issue called non-monetary benefits. This is an interesting one. First of all, in this mechanism, really all of them are non-monetary, or at least likely to be non-monetary. Some countries want money payments, but there are many kinds of non-money payments that can be made that also count as benefit sharing. And an example is a corporation can give free training to Afrodescendants. They can have them come in and get trained on digital sequence technology and analysis. And then they can take it back to their own communities, and they can start doing their own analysis for their own benefits. So training is one. We have made submissions through the IFB that things like, as I said yesterday, harm reduction, passing laws and legislation that reduces the harms of climate change and pollution and other things can also be a form of non-monetary benefit sharing. We're trying to broaden that category because traditionally in a bilateral context, the non-monetary benefits are provided by the one in the contract. So it would be provided by the company, and the company's expertise is in technology. And so that's what they would share. And if you look at list of benefit sharing mechanisms, they're really they draw from this bilateral model that says what can companies do to share benefits that are not based on money. So we're trying to broaden that category. The other thing is that really most of them are non-monetary in the sense that they're not conservation payments. They don't just hand you a bunch of money. This is a big shift from the Nagoya Protocol. In the Nagoya Protocol, when you do a contract, it is suggested that whatever benefits are shared, that helps conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use. But it doesn't enforce it. It doesn't say that it has to be. What the model was, I give you an incentive to share, and then once I have that, then I will do good things for conservation. But the benefit doesn't actually have to benefit conservation. It could build a school. I think it still could build a school because that helps conservation. But it could do anything. That's just between whoever makes the contract. But now everything is non-monetary in a way because it would come out as projects. And so it's not about just sharing the money. Okay, and I'm about ready. I'll have my final comments for today, and then we can open it up for discussion. Next slide. Okay, so let me just again review 15.9. It was a very sensitive political decision to establish this mechanism. So it's not, some parts of some decisions are very strongly supported by all parties, or almost all parties. This one just barely made it across the line. There is, again, this strong debate on whether digital sequence information is even part of the mandate, because those who were against it said it's information, it's not a physical genetic resource, and therefore not a use of a genetic resource. And it was politically sensitive because many parties they're not supportive of having it in there in the first place. And we were shut out from most, the IFB were shut out, and other observers were shut out from most of the discussions. We were allowed to make our statements, but we normally, in the CBD, on issues that would involve Afrodescendants, for example, would include being able to participate in something called a contact group. It's just an informal understanding, and it has to be informal because of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties won't let us formalize it. But informally, we've understood, and we've always, since about 1998, been able to participate in contact groups and in what are called Friends of the Chair groups, which is when you have a very particular in a sensitive, difficult debate, the chair will appoint certain parties and observers especially when it involves indigenous peoples or local community or Afro-descendant issues. They would appoint friends of the chair, and they go into that group, and they get to voice their opinions. Decisions are taken by parties, but you get to engage in the discussion and get your points across. We were shut out of that friends of the chair process, and most of the discussions occurred in the friends of the chair process. But they came out with a compromise. So the paragraphs 6 through 11 understand that these are compromise and agreements. They agreed that digital sequence is a part of the CBD as a utilization of genetic resources, but in return for those parties that did not like to have it in here, they put strict conditions on the fundraising mechanism. So when you read 6 through 11, understand that many of those are really for the countries to limit the scope of the application. So they wanted to make sure that you come up with rules, you can come up with different kind of scenarios, but one, they have to be effective. They have to generate more benefits than cost. They cannot interfere with research. And that was one I said yesterday, we tried to get should not unreasonably interfere. And they didn't like the word unreasonably because that left too much room, open space. They did not like it. So we have to live with this decision. So whatever we come up with these are the decisions of the COP, and we can't change them. Next slide. We were able to get some very important issues in the decision, though, even with this minimum participation. First, in the preamble. Now, a preamble of a treaty or of a decision, even if it's a soft law or not binding, does multiple things. It presents a history, a little bit of the history, where the conversation came from often. It tells you something about the purpose of the decision. It tells you about the aspirations that the parties commit to, but the preamble is not itself a binding, although there's some debate on how binding it is. It's, in my opinion, it's a little more binding, but it also puts in some interpretations and provides guidance to understanding the decisions that are binding. And in my mind, again, all of this taken together is actually part of the binding framework because it gives you your context in which you interpret all the binding decisions. So a lot of people think the preambles are just fluff and not important. They are important because they're important for interpretation of your obligations related to the binding principles. So the first thing we got is a reference to the FAIR and CARE principles. FAIR principles were developed by scientists. It's about how you make sure that there is an openness and that to data, and that people have fair, equitable, and open access to data. Now, open access does not mean free to use in any way. It just means that the data are not behind significant paywalls and so on. They want to make sure that data travels in a fair way so that both North and South and different, all sorts of different peoples and organizations and persons can have access to it. Indigenous peoples have come up with what are called the CARE principles, and they do apply to Afro-descendants. Even though they were developed by indigenous peoples, they are now, some view them at least very broadly. I view them very broadly as principles to ensure that cultural rights and cultural values are taken into account in the research. So you can look up those principles, and tomorrow I'll try to get some links to those, and I'll get maybe somebody here who knows the documents can get the documents made available to you. So those are important principles to look at and understand, because these provide guidance to the parties. And when we talk about the principles of data governance, we will try to, in the operational part, create some principles that will implement these. So it's good to know them, and we can bring in other principles as well. So that's what we're working on. Paragraph 10. Then we also got operational text, and this is the binding part of a treaty or an agreement. And so in the operational text in paragraph 10, again, throughout conversations, we were, up until the next to last day, we had the word primary. Indigenous peoples and local communities would be the primary beneficiaries of the fund. The argument was that technology has its own source of money and its own way of financing development of its own technology. And that really what we need is conservation and sustainable use on the ground. And that it's people living on the ground next, with living in harmony and also integrated with biodiversity, where it's just a completely integrated system. They're the ones to do the conservation. And so we lost the word primary. However, we still, we were the only named beneficiaries. It says Indigenous peoples and local communities, among others. So that's open-ended, means others can be designated, like, maybe countries, maybe corporations, who knows. But there are many parties now that are still supporting, and this is what we need to make sure that, as I will say again several times, here's your role as Colombians. Get your government to support this. As the host country, getting Colombia to support things is a very powerful tool, because as the host, they actually have a bit more power than they normally would in another negotiation. So being the chair, means they have a little bit of power that they can use. So get them to support that Afro-descendants as well also should get some of these benefits. And they're still supporting, making sure most of it goes to those on the ground, but that still hasn't been decided. That's one of our big battles. The decision, also paragraph 11 says, and again, this is not a really highly expansive decision that some have looked at least in my interpretation. This paragraph 11 applies only on principles within the CBD. It says, does not affect existing rights and obligations under the convention and the Nagoya Protocol, including, again, you need to learn to read these legal language in order to interpret it, because as I said yesterday, sovereigns are very careful about their language, and they do not give up their sovereignty lightly or limit their sovereignty lightly. And so what they're saying here with this part is that within the Convention on Biological Diversity and within the Nagoya Protocol, there are certain rights. The good news is that there are also decisions that refer to other rights instruments. And so there is some scope, but again, this is not a full-on endorsement of that. But again, I'll come to another decision the COP has made that helps us out here. But there are rights related to traditional knowledge. And again, this applies to traditional knowledge. And these rights that but also that they cannot run counter to the national measures. Next slide. It's a good decision, but not perfect, not what we'd like. So next slide. Okay, no, sorry, I was looking at my slide. Go back. Okay, and then the last thing is we got in the appendix. Now, the appendix we call the parking lot. It means these are issues undecided. And so this is where undecided, but that will be addressed in this next COP is role, rights, and interest of indigenous peoples and local communities. And your goal is to get Afro-descendants included in that, including associated traditional knowledge. So see, this is open-ended. This says your rights. That includes traditional knowledge, but it also says, by saying including, it means it can include other things than traditional knowledge. Okay, so that's good. And the last thing, which is one of our core issues, is principles of data governance. How are we going to regulate first getting digital sequence information into these databases, and then how do we regulate it once it's in the databases? Next slide. And my final slide is to also remind you of Goal C in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So this is the major biodiversity framework. It's a 30-year plan to save biodiversity. We're in a crisis situation. I think all the parties recognize that. So we came up, we had been making 10-year plans, and the argument was we aren't doing that well on the 10-year plans. We need a much grander, larger vision. My hope is this won't be 30 years before you decide you've failed, that this gives you 30 years to succeed, and we will do it. This is what we all have to put all of our effort towards, is succeeding in these next 30 years. So Goal C says these monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources and digital sequence information on genetic resources and of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources as applicable are shared fairly and equitably, including as appropriate with indigenous peoples and local communities, and substantially increased by 2050. So the good news is we got that into this is a binding framework. So the Decision 15.9 is going to be a voluntary mechanism for the most part. We can get perhaps some non-voluntary parts, like the principles of data governance, but mostly it's going to be a voluntary regime. However, the binding part of the decision in the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework says, one, it will be shared fairly and equitably and with indigenous peoples and local communities, and we can work to get the Afro-descendants into there. And it's substantially increased. And that's actually, the substantially word is an important word. As I said, every word that you introduce to be negotiated will have to be negotiated. And you will need to work with your countries to make sure that they're supportive when they come, before they come to meetings. And so I would say, you really have to work with them before the August meeting of the open-ended working group. And so that they come to that meeting supporting any changes in language that you want to occur. So that's good. And we have the decision 15.9 and so on. Okay, so that's where I'm going to end today. And tomorrow I'm going to go into a little deeper dive in into what we have left to negotiate. And I hope now that you can, I wanted to walk you through that little bit of technical bit on the difference between a genetic resource and digital sequence, and also the issues of intellectual property rights, because you have to keep those all very clear to understand why we're doing this, and also not mix the two different regimes, because they're actually now two different legal regimes, one applying to genetic resources And this will be a new regime that applies to digital sequence information. And now I would like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Preston, for your explanation. It was super clear, not simple, but clear. Thank you very much. So Marlene, I see you that you opened your camera. Maybe you have a question.
No, muchas gracias. No tengo preguntas. Quería hacer también si alguien aquí en el equipo o en las redes sociales tiene algún tipo de pregunta. Revisando, no hay comentarios al respecto.
I do have a short question for Preston. And I wonder how these political tensions can affect the implementation of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, specifically in the topic about digital sequence information, because that come out well as a clear complication, and it can be a situation that we need to look at further in a more deep discussion about that.
Yes, well, first, the Kunming is done. That's settled. They're not going to reverse that. The decision 15.9 is done. There will be something. This mechanism now it could still fall apart. There's a way, I don't think it will. And that's what the negotiations now are doing, is to navigate these politically sensitive issues. So they will have a final decision that if it works, they will make sure, and they have a lot of power. The states still have the upper hand in this. They'll ensure that it doesn't interfere with the Kunming Montreal, which of course could limit, again, the way a CBD negotiation works is you have to get allies. You can put in your suggestions, but a lot of people have a view that you go to make a statement on a microphone. That's helpful. The statements are there so that everybody in the room can hear them. But in reality, if you want to make any kind of success, you have to work heavily with groups, what are called the major groups, like the African group, or the Latin American and Caribbean group, or the megadiverse countries group. Because you really have to get large blocks of parties behind you. So one is, it's good to get Colombia, for example, as host behind you, and to work on some language or principles that they can accept to go into these meetings. And you need to do it before they do, because remember, what countries do is they have consultations within the government. Often they have consultations with industry, and rarely do they have consultations with Afrodescendants. So you need to fix that as well. Make sure you get on their consultation list. And then you go in and you consult with them, and you really work hard to get them to support you. Now, then Colombia can be a strong advocate, not only as the COP presidency, but also they're good advocates within Latin American and Caribbean, which doesn't always hang together. And we know now with recent elections, there are going to probably be some friction points within the Latin American and community group. So yes, they can influence, they will influence. But what you do, again, try to get where you want to go, where you want to drive the process, and work with Colombia and the Latin American and Caribbean groups to support your positions. Because the big groups have the big political capital if they can come to consensus and agree on something. There are individual countries that often have a lot of political capital, but we also know in these negotiations, some countries have a much bigger voice than others. So you have to find those voices that will say, we want this. But remember, when a country says we want this, if they're pushing against if they don't have consensus, so unless there's overwhelming support for your issue and they're pushing against it, what they often have to do is horse trading. That means they say, okay, I'll give you this, but you have to give me that. And so that's something to be aware of. It may come up in your discussions with Colombia, with other members. They'll say, well, what am I getting out of this? And so they'll want different kinds of concessions.
Thank you very much, Preston. Absalom.
Bueno, Absalón no se encuentra por aquí, tuvo un pequeño problema técnico, pero queremos agradecer en nombre del equipo del Instituto de Pueblos, Territorios y Pedagogías para la Paz y por supuesto del proceso de comunidades negras, a Carmen, a Preston, a Redmond por su disponibilidad para la interpretación. Muchas gracias por el espacio. Disculpa pues por los inconvenientes técnicos que tuvimos al inicio. Esperamos mañana vernos puntual a las 9 para finalizar el tema. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Preston. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Ok, hasta mañana. Gracias.